Good evening, and welcome to the League of Women Voters debate on Measures D and E for the November 8th election. I am Bonnie Packer, First Vice President of the Palo Alto League. The League is a nonpartisan political organization whose mission is to encourage informed and active participation of citizens in government. The League does not support or endorse candidates or parties, although it does work to influence public policy through education and advocacy based on our positions, which are developed through study and affirmation by our members. The League does take stands on ballot measures when they fall within our positions. However, we have not yet made decisions on either Measures D or E. This debate, funded by the League of Women Voters Education Fund through contributions from members and community donors, is devoted entirely to voter service activity. We are greatly appreciative for the participation of our co-sponsors for this event. That's the Palo Alto Weekly, Palo Alto Online, Mid-Peninsula Community Media Center, the Palo Alto branch of AAUW, the Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce, and Avenidas Senior Center. This debate is being filmed by the Media Center and will be aired on our cable public access channels, which will all be on Channel 27. And you can go to communitymediacenter.net to find out the times. And if you want, I can tell you them right now. It's tonight, it's live, Sunday at 5:30 in the morning, October 16th. Go to bed early on October 15th. October 19th at noon, that's Wednesday, and Saturday, October 22nd at 6 p.m. So for more information on the elections, we recommend that you visit smartvoter.org or the League website, which is lwvpaloalto.org. And we have a bookmark about Smart Voter, which is a very handy site, and you can find the bookmark on the front table. We also have our voter's guide, which we just published, which has pros and cons on these two measures and some interesting and useful information about the election dates that you need to know. The debaters' campaign materials are on the table in the back, outside the council chambers, because we don't have partisan stuff inside the debate area. But you're invited to stay after the debate to talk with each of the speakers personally. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator for the debate, Sigrid Pinsky.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good evening, everyone. This debate forum provides the opportunity for you to hear from the proponents and opponents of the two City of Palo Alto ballot measures in the upcoming election. Before we begin, I will read a summary of the ballot measure, and then I'll review the format of our session tonight. Measure D is the first measure we're going to be talking about tonight. It concerns binding arbitration. The question is to provide the city with greater control over employee costs, staffing, and services, and allow the City Council to make final decisions regarding all matters related to public safety, employee compensations, benefits, and working conditions. Shall Article 5 of the Palo Alto City Charter be repealed in its entirety, eliminating the requirement that public safety employee disputes be resolved through binding interest arbitration? I have a little more for you. The proposal. This measure would repeal Article 5 of the Palo Alto City Charter, which requires that a 3-member arbitration panel decides disputes over wages, hours, and terms, and conditions of employment for the city's fire and police employees through binding interest arbitration. In addition, Article 5 states that any fire or police employee who participates in a strike shall be terminated from employment and may not be reinstated except as a new employee. The prohibition against striking by firefighters and police officers contained in Article 5 of the Charter is preempted by state law, so that if Article 5 is repealed, the prohibition for public safety employees will remain in effect. State law sets certain minimum requirements for labor negotiations with all public employee unions. Under state law, the city must meet and confer in good faith with unions over wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment for city employees. If the city and unions cannot reach agreement through negotiations, parties may mutually agree upon a procedure. If they still cannot reach an agreement, the city shall implement its last, best, and final offer. However, the city must meet and confer on the disagreed upon issues with the union prior to the adoption of the budget for the next fiscal year. Charter cities, one of which is Palo Alto, may choose to provide additional procedures for some or all employee groups. Article 5 of the Palo Alto City Charter is such an additional procedure, applying to public safety officers only. It states that if the city and public safety unions cannot reach an agreement, the city cannot implement its last, best, and final offer. Rather, the parties appoint a 3-member arbitration panel to decide all unresolved issues. After conducting a hearing, the arbitration panel makes a final decision on each disputed issue. The panel's decision is binding on both sides. If Article 5 is repealed, current state law remains in effect for all city employees, but disputes would no longer be settled by an arbitration panel. I think that's the most I've ever read at one of these. We have ground rules for this evening. The candidates have all received our ground rules, and there are also ground rules for the audience. Civil, respectful behavior is expected at all times. We ask that debaters and members of the audience help maintain an atmosphere of respect and tolerance throughout the forum. Debater comments should pertain to the question at hand. Debate on Measure D will be presented first, followed by a short break, and then Measure E will be debated. The order of each side's opening statement has been determined by drawing lots. Each debate side may have up to 2 participants who will together use no more than the total time allotted. Visual aids, including PowerPoint slides, are permitted with the presentations. The League will provide tables outside the forum room for campaign materials. No campaign materials were permitted in this room other than the visual aids I just described. The moderator will enforce strictly the time limits, and I will. For recordings, the League may authorize a video or radio recording of the program. Only League-authorized recordings are permitted. The debaters agree to be recorded by League-authorized producers. The debaters agree to the use of any recording only in its entirety. This specifically forbids the use of edited versions of the forum on the internet, including campaign websites, YouTube, etc. We're scheduled to finish by 9:30 tonight, and to help us keep on track, we have our timekeeper, Larry Leverchek, here. He will signal speakers with a sign for 1 minute, a sign for 30 minutes, and a 30 seconds, oh goodness, 30 seconds, and a stop sign for when the time is up. We'll be taking written questions throughout the forum. This process allows us to cover as wide a range of issues as possible. Question collectors, can you wave? They're positioned all around the room. They have cards and pencils for you. Please use the cards we're providing. Although the cards indicate that you can direct a question to an individual panelist, for tonight we're going to be giving both sides the opportunity to address all questions. Please, though, designate whether your question concerns Measure D or Measure E on the top so that our question sorters can really tell, and then I can tell. Our question sorters will review the cards and group questions by topic for me. The format for this evening, we'll have opening statements. Each side will get 10 minutes. Each side will get 3 minutes then for rebuttal. We'll go to questions from the audience at that point, and each side will get 2 minutes to answer each question. And speakers, you can take less than 2 minutes if you like. We'll have more questions available. Closing statements will be 5 minutes each, and that will be in the reverse order from the opening statements. On a final note, in the interest of time, and so we can keep this a nonpartisan environment, we ask that there be no applause or other demonstrations of support or of opposition to the measures during the forum. At the end, we'll thank everyone with our applause. Now I'd like to introduce our debaters. The proponents for Measure D tonight: Karen Holman, City of Palo Alto City Council Member; Greg Sharp, City of Palo Alto Council Member; and on the opposing side, Gail Price, City of Palo Alto Council Member; and Richard Alexander, attorney and 35-year Palo Alto resident. And now we are ready to begin. By the lots drawn, the pro side will go first with opening statements.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the League for putting on this event this evening, and thank you to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come this evening. So I'm going to provide a little bit of history of how we arrived at where we are at this point in time. In 1978, Palo Alto voters added binding arbitration to its city charter to prevent police and fire from striking. In 1985, the California Supreme Court ruled that strikes by public safety workers were not lawful. Fast forward, President Obama has identified the loss of public safety jobs as a critical issue. Binding arbitration results in higher pensions for retired firefighters, meaning fewer jobs and thus fewer city services. Worth noting is that SEIU, the city's largest union, largest labor group, are among the lowest paid of city workers. On average, salaries are $70,000. It is important that we retain these jobs and these city services that they provide. Firefighters, by contrast, are paid $120,000 average salary, plus a typical $20,000 a year in overtime, plus benefits, with a total compensation, again, on average, of $225,000 a year. It's worth noting also that only 5% of California cities have binding arbitration. 95% of California cities manage just fine without binding arbitration. In May of this year, the Santa Clara County Civil Grand Jury, in its report titled "Cities Must Rein in Unsustainable Employee Costs," specifically called out Palo Alto and other communities, saying that we really needed to repeal binding arbitration. This is in an effort to rein in these unsustainable employee costs. Palo Alto currently has an unfunded liability of some $44 million in public safety compensation, retirement, and pensions, and this is as of 2009. That's $44 million. Solving this dilemma will have to be borne by either other worker groups, such as SEIU, through additional concessions, lost jobs, or by the public through reduced city services. We've been out of contract with the firefighters for 16 months. In June of this year, the city declared impasse, meaning we could not resolve our issues. We could not come to settlement or agreement. The city council then voted to put repeal of binding arbitration on the ballot. All council members agreed that the current system of binding arbitration does not work. Either repeal or reform was necessary to rein in these unsustainable costs to the city. The fire union filed a complaint with PERB, the Public Employee Relations Board, to keep the voters from deciding this matter. That matter was thrown out. You've recently read in the newspapers of the settlement that we did reach with firefighters, and we are glad to be at that point. How did we get there, though? We got there, again, 16 months without agreement, by declaring impasse, and by spending $140,000 on binding arbitration process, and that's only partially into the process, just as far as we went, and also another approximately $170,000 to put the matter on the ballot. That's $310,000 of taxpayer money better spent on city services to its citizens. The reason that we got the agreement, we believe, is because of the threat of repeal of binding arbitration going before the voters. I'll now turn the mic over to my colleague, Greg Scharf.
Thank you very much, and good evening, and thank you all for coming. On November 8th, the citizens of Palo Alto will be asked to make a critical decision regarding the long-term fiscal health of our city. That is to vote yes in support of Measure D. Voting yes will be a vote to protect valued public services, including funding for our parks, streets, and libraries, and social services. Your City Council has placed this measure on the ballot, and a majority of the Council has endorsed it as a necessity for Palo Alto's long-term fiscal health. So what is binding arbitration? The city charter's provision, which was written by the fire union's attorney, Alan Davis, in 1978, and currently provides that if the city and the union have a dispute, then each side chooses an arbitrator, and the two arbitrators choose a third arbitrator from a panel of labor arbitrators. In the most recent case, the fire union chose as their arbitrator Tony Spitaleri, the president of the fire union. The labor arbitrator panel is primarily comprised of former union attorneys who have a pro-union bias. The decisions they make can have huge negative effects on city budgets and services. Binding arbitration substantially contributed to Vallejo's economic problems and final bankruptcy, and San Jose's current dramatic fiscal problems. Binding arbitration is simply bad public policy and bad government. It ties the hands of the city and places critical budget decisions in the hands of a single person, usually a person with strong labor sympathies who is not concerned at all with Palo Alto's interests. For example, during the last fiscal crisis, SEIU and the management employees took pay cuts and made structural reform to benefits. Fire took between a 4 to 5% raise and refused to participate in any structural changes. This year's budget, for maybe the first time in Palo Alto's history, was not balanced. Rather than cut essential services or ask our other employees to make additional painful cuts, we created a placeholder of approximately $4 million for public safety concessions. Chief Burns, our public safety director, in his presentation to the Finance Committee as to how he would have to balance the budget if fire didn't come to the table, was to lay off 11 police officers, which was simply unacceptable to us. Binding arbitration is the root cause of these types of bad public policy choices that we are often faced with as a city council. Binding arbitration takes local control away from Palo Alto and vests it in a single person with no accountability to the citizens of Palo Alto or anyone else. Our surrounding communities of Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Los Altos, East Palo Alto, and Menlo Park all work fairly without binding arbitration. Binding arbitration makes Palo Alto an outlier. Only 5% of all cities in California have binding arbitration for their public safety employees. 95% of all California cities do not have binding arbitration. An outside arbitrator won't consider the trade-offs between employee benefit costs and preservation of key city services like streets, parks, libraries, and social services. He or she also won't consider whether other city employees will lose their jobs as a result of his or her decisions, or that equity across employing groups is an important principle of basic fairness, one that our City Council has rigorously sought. Unfortunately, a labor arbitrator won't base their rulings on the financial consequences to the city, nor do they weigh whether the ruling is fair to other employee groups who have already had to accept reforms to their salaries, benefits, and pensions. A labor arbitrator simply ignores the trade-offs of fixed pie budgeting, which is what we have in our general fund. That is, if the firefighters take a 4 to 5% raise, as they did during our fiscal crisis, other positions or services must be cut. No arbitrator in California has ever ruled in support of a city's efforts to create a second pension tier, and an arbitrator could undo 10 to 15 years of financial planning with a single decision and without any input from the City Council or local voters. This is a risk Palo Alto can ill afford, especially with an unfunded liability, as Karen said, for public safety, currently at $44 million. Binding arbitration's negative influence isn't only the arbitrator's decisions, however. It is the negative psychological effect on any city council, including ours, knowing that they are unlikely to get a good result from the arbitration process, and therefore accept terms with the union that may not be good with the city, and in the past have not been good for the city. Any city council member who is speaking honestly and forthrightly would acknowledge that the threat of binding arbitration weighs heavily in union negotiations with union boss Tony Spitaleri and the fire department. In 2001, your city council gave a 50% increase to each public safety member's pension, retroactive to the date they were first hired. This is widely recognized as a grave error. This wouldn't have happened without the threat of binding arbitration. Measure D provides flexibility to make the necessary structural changes to out-of-control employee benefit packages, which most people have come to realize are unsustainable. So, a little few facts here. Pension costs for fire and police unions in Palo Alto are up over 30% between 2009 and 2011. Total public safety expenses for the city have risen 80% over the last decade, while the costs of other city departments have largely been stable. If we could have the next slide. So, from 2002 to 2010, the general fund operating expenditures by department increased as follows. 50% for fire, 42% for police, and a mere 6% for the others. However, total calls for fire during 2000 to 2010 increased a mere 6%. If we could have the next slide. So, after a year and a half of stalemated negotiations, the fire union struck a deal within a week of voting on whether... Stop, I didn't see that. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the other side.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and thank you to the League of Women Voters. Vote no on Measure D. This is a matter of principle and values related to treating employees fairly. Binding arbitration works. The City of Palo Alto has a long history as a fair and reasonable employer. Binding arbitration is a key part of this legacy. It is part of the collective bargaining process. Many of the points made earlier by the proponents of Measure D are referring to results of earlier collective bargaining. A significant number of our public safety employees have long careers with the city and have a commitment to Palo Alto to provide excellent and complex services to protect our health and public welfare. While other employees have the option to strike, state law prohibits public safety employees from doing so. They do not have the same collective bargaining rights as others. Binding arbitration encourages both sides to be fair, realistic, and reasonable. Many factors are considered, included but not limited to the city's ability to pay and comparability to other cities. In 1978, over 11,000 voters in Palo Alto voted to add binding arbitration to the Palo Alto Charter. It has only been used 6 times, hardly overused, hardly demonic. Since 1980, the arbitrators panel's decisions favoring the city have been equal to the decisions favoring the firefighters and police officers on each issue. In fact, in each instance of wage proposals, the arbitrator panel chose the city wage proposals over the union proposals in every arbitration decision. Binding arbitration was added because the community believed a fair and balanced process was necessary and appropriate. The solution is to keep binding arbitration in the Charter, but to provide additional language that reforms rather than eliminates it. A revised process, such as introducing a mediation arbitration process where a single person serves in both functions, has great merit. It would protect and improve binding arbitration. We are a community that values innovative solutions to complex challenges. We have those today, and we have those in the future. Palo Alto continues to cherish the principles and values of fairness. We respect and honor all of our employees as they provide creative, valuable, and needed services. Collective bargaining is a critical and fundamental concept of municipal government in California. So the real question is, how do we make it better and improve this important process? Building effective and collaborative relationships among all stakeholders is very important to governance. Excellent and healthy labor relations require creativity, hard work, compromise, and respect. I have faith in this process. Keep binding arbitration in the city charter. Keeping it in the city charter is important. The facts regarding its results underscore this conclusion. We support some reform of the binding arbitration language by including all stakeholders in crafting a solution. This is the Palo Alto way. Do not repeal binding arbitration. Vote no on Measure D. And my colleague Dick Alexander will continue.
To understand this issue, it's important to cut through a number of myths. Myth number 1, binding arbitration is unfair to other city employees. The truth is that binding arbitration levels the playing field for all city employees. Unlike other city employees, police and firefighters don't have the right to strike when a contract negotiation comes to an impasse. Binding arbitration in lieu of the right to strike allows police officers and firefighters the same collective bargaining rights as other city employees. Myth number 2, binding arbitration takes the decisions out of the hands of elected officials. The reality is that the vast majority of contracts with police and firefighters in Palo Alto have been negotiated by city officials at the bargaining table, without resorting to binding arbitration, including last month's contract with the firefighters. The truth is that binding arbitration is rarely used, As Gail mentioned, over its 33-year history, it's only been used 6 times. Myth number 3. Decisions in binding arbitration take away funds from Palo Alto's streets, parks, libraries, and social services. The reality is that that's not true. The last time binding arbitration was used to decide firefighters' wages and benefits was in 1980. The vast majority of the decisions that have had financial consequences for the city were made by city officials at the negotiating table and agreed to by the city. And as one of the foremost critics of city spending over the last 10 years, I dare anyone to counter that honest and fair statement. Myth number 4. Arbitrators don't weigh the financial consequences to the city when making their decisions. That's not true. The city charter demands the financial situation of the city be taken into consideration. If it isn't taken into consideration, then an arbitration award is illegal. It can be set aside in court. Myth number 5. Palo Alto is one of the few cities in the state that has binding arbitration. Well, what's the truth? What's the reality? Palo Alto is one of 21 Northern California cities, including San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Redwood City, Santa Cruz, and Gilroy, that have binding arbitration. Half the states in the country have binding arbitration for firefighters and police officers, including Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Alaska, and Hawaii. Even Wisconsin has arbitration for its police and firefighters. The voters of Palo Alto put binding arbitration in the charter in 1978 because it values fairness. The inability of police and firefighters to strike means there needs to be a reasonable process for dispute resolution. That's what this is all about. Myth number 6, arbitration is costly to the city. Well, that's good. It's costly for both sides. The system is structured to encourage both sides to negotiate at the bargaining table so they don't have to go to binding arbitration. The cost of binding arbitration to both sides is one of the incentives that keeps both sides at the negotiating table. Myth number 7, arbitrators are typically biased towards unions. The reality, that is simply not true. The city selects an arbitrator, a union selects an arbitrator, and together they must mutually agree upon the third neutral from a list provided by the state. These arbitrators make their living by being fair. When chosen, they are agreed upon by both sides in the dispute. And any arbitrator who is showing bias by siding with one party or another is not going to be selected again. Their histories are well known. Myth number 8, you heard it here tonight, the mere threat of binding arbitration has forced the city to make concessions. Well, I'll tell you that's nonsense. And it's nonsense because that presumes the city is powerless to negotiate on its own with public safety officers. The most recent successful contract negotiation with the firefighters last month, which resulted in concessions from the firefighters, demonstrates there is no basis to the claim that the current system forces the city to make concessions. Myth number 9. With binding arbitrations, decisions are made by third-party arbitrators who are from outside Palo Alto. Well, the fact of the matter is that they are neutrals, and they include people from Palo Alto. John Cagle, one of the most famous arbitrators in the country and a former president of the National Academy of Arbitrators, lives here and has served as an arbitrator. And Richard Whitmore, a long-standing Palo Alto resident, a specialist in city labor negotiations, has also served as an arbitrator. To understand this proposition, I have 1 minute, is you have to cut through it. You have to understand that the issue is not about pension reforms or salaries. That's a total red herring. The real issue is, how are we going to treat police and firefighters with management respect?
Thank you.
I came in okay. Thank you.
Did very well. We're going to move to rebuttals now, and I just want to encourage anyone in the audience, if you have questions, get them over, because the next section is questions from the audience. For the rebuttals, we'll go back over to this side, please.
Thank you. And to address just a few points here, binding arbitration being a legacy in Palo Alto, I say it's a legacy we just cannot sustain. As to fairness, we have essential utilities employees that do not have the right to strike and do not have binding arbitration, and that system has worked really well for Palo Alto. Taking Palo Alto's fiscal situation into consideration in terms of a binding arbitration arbitrator, San Jose tried to add something that better constrained what an arbitrator could decide on their decisions having to do with Palo Alto, with San Jose's future. They are still facing serious, like $100 million budget deficits next year. And that is largely because of the compensation for public safety workers. There was really no rebuttal to the 5% of California cities not having binding arbitration. That only 5% of California cities have binding arbitration. 95% don't have binding arbitration.
Thank you. Well, I do mostly defense work. Counsel does mostly personal injury, so his myths are my truths in this. I think that's absolutely true.
I object to ad hominem arguments. And
at its core,
I'd ask the chair to rule him out of
Mr.
order.
Alexander.
Measure D is about fiscal responsibility and who will control Palo Alto's fiscal destiny. I've been in those labor negotiations. I can tell you 100% the threat of binding arbitration is what drives them. And anyone who says different is not understand the process and hasn't been through it. There's absolutely no way anyone can say that who's been through it with a straight face. And I'll say it again. Only the risk of repeal of binding arbitration got this deal with the firefighters. If it hadn't happened, what would have happened is we would have gone to binding arbitration. And the result would have been bad for Palo Alto. And the only reason they settled is they didn't want to lose binding arbitration. That's what happened. And the myth that an arbitrator's decision can be overturned in court if they don't take into consideration Palo Alto's financial situation. Do you know what Palo Alto's financial situation is considered by arbitrators? They consider us a rich city. They look at situations of places like Vallejo, and they say to themselves, Palo Alto is a rich city with lots and lots of resources. And no, you can't overturn an arbitrator's decision in court without basically fraud. I've done lots and lots of arbitrations, and the standards are very, very high. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have rebuttal from this side.
Thank you. Binding arbitration is a fair process for all parties. Since 1978, when binding arbitration was added to the charter by the voters, binding arbitration decisions have chosen final proposals by each side in equal numbers. The binding arbitration process promotes fair and balanced results. It is an equitable way to settle disputes. The process encourages each party to make reasonable and balanced proposals to the arbitrator and the panel to work on workable solutions. Because collective bargaining generally works, binding arbitration is infrequently used. It remains, however, very, very important. The removal of binding arbitration for public safety workers is short-sighted and unwarranted. In over 35 years, it has not been abused as a form of conflict resolution. So why would we consider removing binding arbitration, an option which has worked? We want to continue to have a legacy of fairness and to focus on building positive and collaborative relationships with our employees, including fire and police personnel. That is their expectation as well, and the resolution of the recent collective bargaining is a very positive move in that direction. The solution is to keep binding arbitration in the Charter and to provide additional language that reforms the process and scope rather than eliminates it. It would continue to work and it would improve. The inclusion of binding arbitration in the Charter is a decision to be made by the voters in the City of Palo Alto. This debate is not about pension reform and other issues that have been raised. It is about the protection of binding arbitration as a critical part of collective bargaining, specifically for fire and police personnel. It is about being fair and collaborative in finding solutions. That is what we all want. That is what we promote. That is what our expectations are. And I would expect that the community believes that as well. Vote no on Measure D.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the audience questions. The first question, the arguments regarding Measure D seem to pit control on one side versus fairness on the other. Can either side point to a specific bad position that was forced on the city via binding arbitration? And then in parentheses, weren't costly benefits granted by the city council and not by arbitrators? I'm going to let this side go first.
Absolutely correct. Works better with a microphone on. Absolutely correct. The city council and city managers, time after time, have agreed to labor contracts on their own. They've made the decision. And they've had to make these decisions in order to have the type and the quality of law enforcement that we have and fire protection that we have in Palo Alto. It hasn't been anything that's been forced by any arbitrator. There has only been one occasion in the 1980s where the issue of, where an economic issue, the wages and hours issue, was decided at binding arbitration. And in that one case, in 1980, the decision came down in favor of the city. The process is designed to drive people to be reasonable. Each side makes a proposal. It's often referred to as Texas arbitration. The arbitrator doesn't negotiate between the two. The neutral arbitrator is required to pick the most reasonable when taking into consideration the city's finances and its ability to pay. So making an outlandish argument means you'll lose. The system is designed to force fairness, but more importantly, it supports respect for police and fire. It treats them respectfully in a management process that is collaborative, that is a partnership. Remember, these are the people that when we dial 911, we want them there, and we want the best right away. And this is one way of showing respect.
Thank you very much. This side?
Thank you. Yes, if you look at the prior arbitration decisions, you'll notice that any time the city has attempted any sort of structural reform, they've lost. If you notice, what the city asked for a two-tiered pension system once before, they lost on it. They wanted a anti-spiking provision, basically that wouldn't allow you to take the last year that you worked as your basis for your pension and wanted the last 3 years. They lost on that. So the answer is yes. Is that any time you tried structural reform, you would lose before an arbitrator. The arbitrators would go with the status quo, and they'd look at what other cities had. So anytime you tried any sort of structural reform, you'd lose. And that is the issue on that. Hey, Karen, you want to add anything?
Just a couple of comments I would add. The ability to pay. This is an issue that is described differently by different people. I would say that arbitrators decide that in a very different way. Again, San Jose has tried to add language to their charter in reform by identifying what things can be counted as part of ability to pay, and yet they are in the dire straits that they are in. Palo Alto's city attorneys, looking at various reformed binding arbitration around the state, came up with a reform that was put before the council to decide upon. It's 4 pages long, and we still were not concerned, or we still had concerns that enough areas were covered that would not then become issues at an arbiter's table. Partnership, absolutely. Our employees are valued members of the community, But we need partners at the table and not partners that we have to struggle with year in and year out to try to get concessions from the firefighters, especially, where we do get concessions from other unions. We need that kind of partnership. It just really isn't attainable through binding arbitration.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the median pension of public safety employees? Sorry, Larry. I'm out of time. I'll start over. What is the median pension of public safety employees, and what average number of years service is this based on? And I'm going to have this side go first this time.
Well, I don't know the actual number of the median amount, but it's based on a formula, and the current formula is 3 at 50. So for every year you've worked, you get 3% of your salary, and you get to retire at age 50. So if your average salary is, when you retire, is $140,000, you would probably get 90% of that if you worked 30 years for the rest of your life. That would be your average pension, something along those lines. You have anything to add to that? So, yeah, that's all I have to add to that.
All right, we'll go to this side.
The issue before us is the issue of binding arbitration, and as it relates to the charter. I will make one comment, though, about the pension formula. The original pension formula, which came into effect, I believe it was in the 80s, was a city proposal during collective bargaining, and it had absolutely nothing to do with binding arbitration at the time. Did you want to make additional comment?
This is not about pension reform. This is not about salaries. This is about dispute resolution. What happens when the rock hits the hard place? How do you come to a resolution to end an impasse? And the way we've decided to do it is a fair and equitable process. Both sides select a neutral third party. They have to mutually agree upon that person. So they don't select someone off the street. They select someone who has background, training, experience, understanding, and track record. And when both sides mutually agree on a third party, that's how a dispute can be resolved. So we're talking about dispute resolution. If you want to talk about pensions and you want to talk about who's making money in this town, let's talk about the money that is shifted out of the general fund and how we operate the utilities and how we move city employees. We morph them into utility employees. We make street cleaning a utility. We make traffic lights a utility, sidewalk cleaning a utility. And you get to pay higher utility bills and a higher utility tax because of that. If you want to have that discussion, come on, I'm ready. But not tonight. This is about fairness.
Thank you. I'm going to combine these next two questions. They're sort of different, but I think they'll go together. One is, if public safety workers can't strike, how can they protect their rights if they can't reach agreement? And the second question is, if Measure D passes and the city and public safety unions are at an impasse, how does it get resolved? I'm going to let this side go first.
In the old days, it used to be known as the blue flu. Police officers in some cities just didn't show up. You dial 911 and they say, you get a recording saying you have to wait. Your spouse could be choking or laying out on the front lawn with a heart attack. The bottom line is that what we have in Palo Alto treats these employees with equitable respect for the important jobs that they have. And that's what this is all about.
Thank you.
Oh,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks. Even without binding arbitration, public safety unions will continue to have very strong labor protections. The City Council has an obligation to negotiate with them in good faith. If we're not negotiating with them in good faith, they can take us to the Public Employee Relations Board and file complaints. They're not shy about that at all. I wouldn't worry about them. They have all of their strong collective bargaining rights that they have. And there seems to be very little problems with that. Other cities, 95% of all other cities in California, negotiate that way with their public safety employee unions. And it works. There's no reason to have binding arbitration. This is about the ability to control one's fiscal future. This is about pensions. This is about services. This is about what you want Palo Alto to be. You just had to look at that chart of public safety. You just have to see the incredible ramp up in public safety costs. And you just have to see that without the repeal of binding arbitration, you cannot lock in the reforms that we've just achieved in the most recent settlement. If we don't repeal binding arbitration, what's likely to happen, it could happen 5 years, 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now. All that needs to happen is a single, unelected arbitrator to decide to change the pension formula more favorable, as was done in 2001, and it's retroactive. Every new hire going back to their first date of employment will have the new pension formula. That's a PERB rule. PERB requires you to do that. So at any time that pension formula is increased, they get it all the way back to when they were first hired. That's how you got a 50% increase in pensions in 2001. And if you look at the dollars that cost the city, it's staggering, absolutely staggering.
Thank you very much. The next question, which might be our last, describe more fully what kind of modifications to binding arbitration could be made by the City Council. And this side goes first. Yep. Describe more fully what kind of modifications to binding arbitration could be made by the City Council. In other words, couldn't it be modified instead of all or nothing?
So I'll just start with this. Basically, I think that they've had 30 years to propose modifications to binding arbitration. Anyone who actually thinks that the fire union wants to modify binding arbitration, I just don't believe it for a second. They've had 30 years for the propose reforms. Only when we started talking about repeal did people start talking about reform. And you watch, it'll get mired down in meet and confer obligations. In fact, they're suing on meet and confer right now as an obligation in terms of the repeal. So I don't believe it for a second. But Karen, go ahead.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, Palo Alto did look at reform. That was the choice before the City Council, reform versus repeal. 4 pages, fine print, trying to resolve some way to reform that seemed reasonable and that could be predictable, provide a predictable future for Palo Alto's economic situation. The cities of Vallejo, as you know, has filed bankruptcy. That was largely because of unconstrained pension benefits. It's interesting to note here, too, and I think it's an important point, that benefits are extended also to spouses, to dependents of these employees. If you think that Palo Alto elected officials wouldn't change some of these things if we really had the power within our control to do this. Now, we're not going to do anything extreme because we need to be fair and commensurate with other communities, but we need to have the power in our hands to be accountable to the public, to be able to make some structural change that, again, as Greg has mentioned, no arbitrator has agreed with making any kind of structural change. Petaluma, for instance, faced with these kinds of economic forecasts, they laid off their entire planning department. They eliminated the entire department, contracted it out. That means a loss of public sector jobs. It means a loss of union jobs.
Thank you. This side, please.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we did at Policy and Services have extended discussion about potential modifications. And one of the issues with that discussion was we were being pressed by a deadline for the ballot measure, and there was not a lot of time to intensively and in a meaningful way meet with the representatives of public safety. And that, I am convinced, was a factor in that process. As I mentioned earlier, one of the approaches that we could take is to introduce the concept of MEAD-ARB, which is mediation arbitration. It's a combined process. It's used successfully in many, many cities, including the city and county of San Francisco. And in that process, what it does is it puts the mediator role and arbitrator role in a single person, so that the issue of discussing the details with both parties is very straightforward, and it allows great flexibility on the part of this individual to come to terms and to reach a resolution. It is very effective, and I think that that would be a needed and useful improvement in this process. There are many other modifications we could think of. I am absolutely convinced that some modification would be appropriate, some reform is useful, and that would be far preferable to repealing binding arbitration, which is a fair process.
Thank you. We have one last question. Isn't this the end of collective bargaining for public employees, like what happened in Wisconsin? This side will go first.
Couldn't say it better myself.
I agree. I think one of the issues here, as certainly from my perspective, is that the way some of this discussion is going, it's a veiled and unveiled discussion of the merits of collective bargaining, which is fundamental to our democracy. It's fundamental to governance. It's fundamental to the treatment of employees. My concern continues to be, if we go down this, quote, erosion path, then we are becoming like Wisconsin and other entities like that. It's very, very disturbing. And Palo Alto, when it's convenient, we compare ourselves to other communities. When it's inconvenient, we do not. Palo Alto has always made a big deal about making thoughtful and compassionate decisions per the conditions in Palo Alto. The sophisticated electorate, the voters, the community at large are very thoughtful, and this is very, very critical. I'm very concerned about the way some of this discussion is going as proposed by the proponents of Measure D.
Gail, you're absolutely right. The last thing we want is to have a relationship of them versus us. We do not want to be opponents. We want to work collaboratively in a partnership, and that's good management. It's good management because it's management with respect, as opposed to management by tyranny, by dictation.
Thank you. This side?
Sure. Them versus us, arbitration leads to them versus us. You have, in other cities, you work collaboratively on that. We work collaboratively with our other unions. Them versus us, that is what arbitration drives you to. Because why not ask for arbitration? Why not move forward on that? Why not hold out like the fire department did for 16 months without a contract? Why not just keep it going like that and see what you can get? Why make the concessions now? Why act reasonably? Why act in good faith? Why not just push for arbitration? And yes, employees will keep all of their collective bargaining rights. This is California. They have strong rights with PERB, strong collective bargaining rights. This doesn't change that. As again, 95% of all cities don't have this. Other employees don't have this. So it doesn't change it. This isn't anti-union. This is pro-union, frankly. This will preserve union jobs. This will preserve services. I'll bet you that SEIU was pleased that fire made the concessions they did. Karen?
Yes. At its core, Measure D is about fiscal responsibility, and it is about dispute resolution. I agree with Mr. Alexander. It is about dispute resolution, but we need to find a way to resolve our differences in a way that doesn't really hold the hands of the City Council, the elected officials that are responsible to you, the voters. Palo Altans have been very clear. They want the city government to reform its cost structure and match the economic realities we face. We cannot continue the way that we have. Again, only 5% of California cities have binding arbitration. Palo Alto, which is usually on the forefront of leading ways to manage and govern.
Thank you very much. That concludes the question portion of the night. It always goes so quickly. So that brings us to closing statements. Each side will get 5 minutes. And as I explained earlier, we go in reverse order of opening statements, which leads us to start over here.
Thank you. Thank you to the League for providing this opportunity for us to debate these issues tonight. All of us admire and value Palo Alto's police officers and firefighters. And we want our police and firefighters to be treated with respect, especially in the rare case when both sides in a labor dispute cannot come to an agreement and negotiations come to a standstill. The issue before us is not about pension reform or salaries or city spending or city waste. That's a red herring. I'm ready to have that debate, but this is not the issue before us. The real question on which we must focus is how do you provide fundamental fairness to your employees when, unlike other city unions, police and fire unions are not allowed to strike? Palo Alto provides the answer by using a special form of binding arbitration that is designed to achieve fairness. City, union, and a mutually agreed upon neutral must consider each side's proposals. And those proposals must take into account, as a matter of law, changes in the cost of living, the conditions of employment of other employees who perform similar services, the financial condition of the city, and the city's ability to comply with the decision of the arbitrators. Only one proposal can be selected. That keeps the process honest, and it forces both sides to be reasonable. Can we make it better? San Francisco, Salinas, San Leandro, and Sacramento have a hybrid form of arbitration that also includes simultaneous mediation. It's important to understand that under California law, mediation allows parties in a dispute to confidentially discuss settlement proposals with the arbitrators, in this case, who can meet separately with both sides and work to bring about an agreement. In the cities that I mentioned, mediation is allowed during arbitration, after all the testimony is taken, after all the evidence is on the table, and any time before a final decision is rendered. That's a reform that Palo Alto should consider. Everyone in Palo Alto values fairness and wants to ensure that all city employees are treated fairly. Police and firefighters have the most demanding jobs in our town, and they perform them with class and professionalism. Our house burned down in 1982. The best sight I ever saw was the fire captain who walked me back in the house to help collect the photographs off the wall and to cover a couple of pieces of furniture so they wouldn't be damaged by water. Our daughter Meredith, when she was 3 years old, walked away at 6 o'clock in the morning. And the doorbell rang, and there was Meredith holding the finger of a police officer who walked her back to the front door. Our son was in a massive crash and was cared for by the firefighters. I was in a rear ender by someone who fell asleep on the Oregon Expressway and plowed into me at 35 miles an hour. And I valued the care that was provided to me by those firefighters. And the best sight you'll ever see are the turnouts coming into your house when someone is in need of special medical care. We should keep the process that has served us well and one which provides fairness, equity, and respect to public safety officers whom we expect to protect us and keep us safe. Telling our police and firefighters that city management will always have the last word all the time in all labor disputes is simply disrespectful of these employees. Join the Democratic Central Committee and join us in voting no on D. Keep this law on the books. Do not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Thank you. Now to this side.
Thank you. This is about pension reform. This is about fiscal responsibility, and this is about protecting structural change. The recent Santa Clara grand jury report recognized this and stated that binding arbitration was contributing to unsustainable long-term financial obligations for cities. And the report recommended specifically, named Palo Alto, that Palo Alto should end the practice of binding arbitration. Public safety will remain the most important service, or one of the most important services that Palo Alto provides its citizens. Our firefighters and police are valued members of the community, and they do provide critical services. As council members, we recognize that both we and the community want us to have a top public safety department, and that we expect that we always will. This will not change. However, you should all note that recently, Palo Alto opened up recruitment for a new firefighter. In 72 hours, we received almost 2,000 applications and had to shut the process down. In 72 hours, almost 2,000 applications. Because of binding arbitration, public safety employee compensation has continued to rise dramatically. Those are the facts. It's the threat of binding arbitration. I've said that over and over again. That's what it is. It's not the actual arbitrations. It's the threat of them. That's what informs negotiations. That's what the discussions are about. So, please join a majority of your city council, a number of former mayors, including Laney Wheeler, Yuriko Kishimoto, and Bern Beecham, to repeal binding arbitration now. As the Palo Alto Weekly said on May 6, 2011, this outdated practice cannot continue. Measure D is an essential step enabling your elected officials to manage the fiscal future of Palo Alto while holding them accountable for the results. If you want to hold us accountable, we need to have the tools with which to do it. Karen, you want to add some?
Just a couple of thoughts, if I might. Public safety employees, and you have heard this by everyone up here, public safety employees are valued members of our staff, valued members of our community. There is no thought otherwise. They are valued, respected, and treasured. They are just absolutely essential services by definition. Respectful negotiations that can respond to changed economic times while also being respectful and also being responsible. That is what we really need to arrive at. Repealing binding arbitration will help us be respectful while also responsible. The citizens of Palo Alto have asked us to be accountable and asked us to respond to changed economic times and balance our city budget. Other communities, other cities, without binding arbitration, have been able to make changes that have better responded to changed financial times. Palo Alto's elected officials need, with the responsibility, also need the ability to be able to make these changes. Join us in voting yes on Measure D. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our debaters for Measure D for coming tonight. I'd like to thank the audience for coming tonight and for staying. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll go to our debate of Measure E. Thank you.